to an Indigenous perspective on media. My name is Eden Fineday. Eden Fineday Nitsikason. Tanse Niwagamagana Gegwa Nitotemtik. Greetings, my friends and relatives. So I am from the Sweetgrass First Nation, Sweetgrass First Nation Ochinia. That's in Treaty 6 territory. This photo is me on the road that was named after my family on our reserve. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about myself before I move on to telling you a little bit about IndigiNews. So like many Indigenous people, I navigate multiple identities. I'm half Cree and half Ukrainian. So these are some of my ancestors. On the left are my maternal grandparents, Mary Jo and Joseph Rohatton. So my grandmother, Mary Jo, was born in Canada to Ukrainian immigrants, and my grandfather, Joseph, emigrated to Canada as a teenager. He was born in Poland / the Ukraine. Apparently that border was often changing because of wars, but he was a Ukrainian speaker. He died before I was born, so I never met him. On the right is my great-great-grandfather, Fineday. He was born in the 1850s and died in the 1930s. Fineday was a renowned warrior and a powerful medicine man. People called him, they refer to him now as a war chief, which means that he was the head of the warrior society in our band of Plains Cree. He was the last generation of my Cree relatives to live life free on the plains. He died on Sweetgrass Reserve. And this is just a fun little collage of some folks in my family. So on the top left there is my Kukum, Irene Day. This picture was taken at her 90th birthday party. She made her transition to the spirit world about 4 years after this photo was taken. She passed on in 2017 or thereabouts. And then next to her is her grandfather, Fineday. So this is the same man as in the other slide, as an older man. The headdress that you can see on him in this photograph is now in the Royal Alberta Museum, along with other important possessions of his, such as his pipe. On the far right is a funny picture I came across. That small child there is my dad. He was born in 1947 and he's 76 now. So yeah, that might have been what, 1953 or so? 1952. I just love that photo. It's so cute. On the bottom right is me and my mother. And then next to us on the left is a picture of me and my two boys. It's kind of a bad picture. I'm actually standing in front of the same Fineday Road sign, but you can't see it in this photo. And then, of course, more importantly, this is Gus and Maybell. They are my dogs. I'm teasing. That's not more important, but come on. They're gorgeous, and they're my little spirit guardians. They take care of me. But seriously, these two are my raison d'être. They are my reason for being. They are my sun and moon, my dawn, my dusk, my true loves, my soulmates. I'm so grateful to be able to pass on my culture to them. They are deeply involved in our ways. These two know more about their culture right now than I did until I was about 40. That's beautiful to me. That's us. That's something awakening, you know, things that have been asleep are coming back to us. So they know more Cree than I did until I was about 40. And I like to joke with them, since they're so white passing and white looking, I tell them that they're my stealthy Crees. So watch out. You might not know there's Crees in the room with you, but they are. We ceremony together. We talk about everything, the human world, the spirit world, our obligations and responsibilities. And of course, we talk about Minecraft, Roblox, and YouTube. So I am the publisher of IndigiNews. I've been with IndigiNews since the fall of 2021. My journey to IndigiNews was not a straight path. I've lived in 3 different countries. I've worked for the federal government for 10 years. while performing as a musician. I don't come from a journalism background. In some ways, when I see where I am now, it almost seems unbelievable. It feels strange that I would be in this position. But I don't believe in chance or coincidence. I walk a spiritual path, one that was passed on to me from my father, passed down to him from his elders. And those teachings include that I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be right now. So my life has led me to IndigiNews for a reason. So here I am. And I have the great privilege of working with an amazing team. On the left, I'll just point out this picture here. So on the left, so straightforward is Savannah News, but just to the left of hers, that's Kara McKenna. She's IndigiNews' editor. She is my rock. She is the quality control person. Her bar is set high. She ensures that what we do is excellent journalism. She is a traditionally trained journalist, and she's from Treaty 6 territory. She's Cree. And then I don't have time to go through everyone else, but they're all such beautiful people. They're so wonderful. Well, maybe I will quickly. So those two in the back on the left is Dion Phillips, and then the tall guy in the center back is Spencer Sacked Lund. They were both participants in our mentorship program last year, and now they've both been hired on with IndigiNews, which is so exciting for us. Next to Spencer is Aaron Hemmons. He's the Okanagan reporter. Down below that is me and Anna McKenzie. She was the child welfare and education reporter until December. She's moved on to work with Indigenous communities who are crafting their own child welfare policies. It's her dream job. And then Savannah Manus in the front and center is the one who took the photo. She was with us briefly doing social media. She's a comedian. Check her out on TikTok. And then behind Savannah, that's Stephanie Wood. She's actually not from IndigiNews. She works for the Narwhal, but she's another amazing Indigenous journalist. Most of the people here are Cree to some degree or another. That just, that was an accident, I swear. And so, yeah, I'll go on to tell you a little bit more about what we do. So what is Indigenous media? Clear-cut answer to that question. But at its heart, I believe it means sharing a perspective that acknowledges the two seeing that is the reality for most Indigenous people in so-called Canada. We walk in two worlds. And in one of them, we are almost completely unknown. So even for as long as we've been neighbors with non-Indigenous Canadians, they really haven't asked much about us. Europe came and assumed superiority without actually knowing who we were or the knowledge systems that we carry. Indigenous media, for me, is media that acknowledges who we are, acknowledges that reality. And that's what we try to do at IndigiNews. So even if we're just writing straightforward news occasionally, we hold a different understanding. And I believe that comes through in our reporting. And then there's some style ways that we, style guides that also reinforce that. So like all newsrooms, we have a style guide. And the style guide is it's sort of like the rule book you're given, how do you capitalize cities, or like how do you use quotation marks, all sorts of stuff. How do you do your photo captions? Just sort of like a rule book, and every newspaper and news outlet has a style. Ours is a little bit different. We, for instance, in our style guide, we say you capitalize the words elder, youth, and knowledge keeper. We do this because these are considered to be sacred roles within our communities. When we cover the death of Indigenous people, we try to emphasize their humanity. We mention their first names in the headline or the deck, the subheadline. We try to demonstrate that they were loved family members and not just some random, deceased person that it's assumed our readers don't care about. We assume our readers care about these people as human beings. And that's what we tried to do when we wrote about Jared Lowndes. So he was killed by the RCMP in 2021, and this is his mother here, Laura Holland. Basically at IndigiNews, we try to center the humanity of our people in our coverage. It's pretty basic. It's not that complicated, but it's actually not something that's done very often. It's something, that sort of treatment of humanity is something that's been denied to Indigenous people when they're written in mainstream media, and has been denied to us since the dawn of, mainstream newspapers. This is a beautiful photograph taken by Erin Hemmons, our reporter in the Okanagan. So I just wanted to talk a bit more about mainstream media. It's been harmful to Indigenous people. There's a lot of reasons why. One of those, is because of our culture is kind of an entire universe that exists within our families and our communities, but it's been completely ignored by mainstream media because they don't know about it. Because of that, our truths aren't acknowledged. Instead, what happens is this concept of objectivity that's sort of used against us, because mainstream media, traditionally, objectivity has meant, a middle-class white man, because he's considered to be neutral, and anyone else is sort of biased. Like, for a long time, Indigenous people, even when they joined the newsroom, weren't allowed to report on their own communities because they were seen as biased. Like, someone in my newsroom, she wasn't allowed to report on Idle No More when it was happening because she was Native. That was back in 2011, 2012. So it wasn't that long ago where the concept of objectivity was used against us. And the other thing is, white journalists tended to practice what we refer to as parachute journalism. So when there's like a trauma, they parachute in, take some pictures of us crying in our rubble, and then they're gone. There's no relationship there. They're not practicing good kinship. So that's part of it. So for most of the life of mainstream media, it has just perpetuated and reflected the prejudice of mainstream Canadian culture. And so for me, this has been a goal, is to share a different side of who Indigenous people are with everybody. For us, it's about cross-cultural communication. That's actually a teaching of mine, that I'm supposed to be doing that. I'm supposed to be sharing my culture with non-Indigenous people as a way to build understanding, respect, and just to become, to understand each other, know each other, to get to know our neighbors. We live together. We should know about each other. But our realities are just so different. And so, for instance, I'm the daughter of a residential school survivor. And I hope you don't mind if I share a few difficult examples of experiences that Indigenous people have undergone. For me, I have struggled with, how do I reconcile, the fact that my dad was beaten until his spirit left his body, and he was hovering on the ceiling watching get kicked by a priest. How do I reconcile that with the way that mainstream media portrays us? He was out of his body, and he saw the priest drag his to the showers and then turn on the scalding hot water, and then turn that off and turn on the freezing cold water, and just back and forth until he came back into his body and regained consciousness. Like, the horror of our experiences. How do I reconcile that with how we're perceived, what people believe about us, the denialism about residential school that sort of has popped up and is proliferating? We do terrible things in these institutions. But sometimes, even though these things are common knowledge in our families, common knowledge in our communities, they're not reported on because they can't be independently verified. Because our witness statement isn't enough for Canada to believe, that hurts. That hurts us as a people, as a community. And it also makes us angry and makes us feel like, or for me personally, I look at mainstream media and I'm like, you have failed us. You have failed us. It's been a painful journey, right? But But of course, there's so much more than pain to who we are. Um, we are more than our trauma. Duncan McHugh talks about the 4Ds of reporting on Indigenous people. He's a well-known journalist. The 4Ds refer to the most common stereotypes that mainstream media uses when talking about Indigenous people. So the 4Ds stand for drinking, dancing, drumming, and dead. Which for like decades were sort of, if you go back and you look at archives of coverage of Indigenous people from the 50s to the 2000s, like a big chunk of stories fall into those categories. So in IndigiNews, obviously, we try not to perpetuate stereotypes. And for us, that's easy to do because there's such a large breadth of experience across Indigenous homelands. There isn't one story or one trait that can sum any of us up or any of these communities up. We are varied, we are vibrant, we are joyful, we are kind, we are loving, we are beautiful, and we are everything else, just like most people. So for me, what is Indigenous media? If we have a platform, it is our responsibility to do our best to make something beautiful and share that with the world. That's what Indigenous media is to me. And when we do that, miracles can happen. I'd like to share a little story with you all about the role that responsibility has played in my life and a small miracle that has happened in my life. I received an email on Christmas Eve from a reporter at the Washington Post. His name is Andrew Tran, and he's one of the reporters who worked on putting together a database of human remains held by the Smithsonian Institution. I don't know how he found me, but in his email, he just said, he noticed that we report on Indigenous issues and he thought that we might find this database interesting. I found it more than interesting. I found my ancestor, Little Poplar. So he was my grandfather, Alphonse's grandfather. So this is a picture of me with my grandfather, Alphonse, circa, I think, 1986. He was dying of lung cancer at this time. He died shortly after this picture was taken. So my grandmother from one of the earlier slides, the one in the purple dress on her 90th birthday, this was her husband, Alphonse. And this on the right is a picture of what's called an accession card. It's the file number where they cataloged the human remains of my great-great-grandfather, Little Poplar. And it's hard to see, but it says one box, skull of Little Poplar, Cree Indian sub-chief from Canada. So just like Fineday was, Little Poplar was head of the Warrior Society in his band. And they were sometimes called sub-chiefs, war chiefs. Basically, they're the folks who take over in times of war. They become the leader of the band in times of peace. And for most of the time, it's the actual chief. But they become the chief, in times of active war. So that email from Mr. Tran set up a cascade of events in my life. It was shocking, very upsetting, very disturbing. Spent a few days processing that. But then I realized I was actually going to be close to DC in late February. I'm currently in a program at the City University of New York. And I have to be in New York the last week of February. And New York's like 2 hours by a train from Washington, D.C. So I realized I had the opportunity to go to the Smithsonian's Museum of Natural History, which is where Little Poplar's remains are being held. But I wasn't sure what to do about it. I felt doubt. I was unsure if I should go. I thought surely there's other family members that might, want to go or might better represent the family. Maybe I wasn't a close enough relation. I also believed that the Smithsonian would be like a bureaucratic nightmare to try and navigate. I feel like many Indigenous people feel overwhelmed by government bureaucracy that they've imposed. And that goes back, of course, to the Indian Act and how for decades we weren't allowed off the reserve without a written pass, or just the ways that laws have been used to suppress us. Like we weren't allowed to hire lawyers. My grandmother, we weren't even allowed to vote until 1964. And that's when my grandmother was able to vote. So like the government for us, the bureaucratic nightmare, the trauma is real. And I assumed that would, be the case with the Smithsonian. But I called my dad. I told him the situation. I asked him if he thought it was a good idea for me to go, and I expressed my uncertainty to him. And his response was a revelation to me. He said, "If you have the opportunity to go, then it is your responsibility to do so." That was a teaching. It helped me better understand who I am as a Cree woman. It made me reevaluate all of my responsibilities and my opportunities. So last week, I emailed the Smithsonian. I explained to them who I was and that I had discovered my great-great-grandfather was in their collection. I didn't know if they would respond, or if they did, how long it would take before I heard back. But the next morning at 9 a.m., my phone rang. It was the head of the repatriation department of the Smithsonian Institution, Dorothy Lippert. Dorothy was ecstatic that I had reached out. She was thrilled to be talking to me. She's a Choctaw woman, the first Indigenous woman, the first woman and the first Indigenous person to run the museum's repatriation department. From that phone call, what's now happening is I will be in Washington, D.C. to visit my relative at the Smithsonian from March 3rd to March 4th. They're flying me out there. They're putting me up in a hotel. Like, it was instantaneous. It was easy. So I didn't know when I opened that email. Nope, sorry, let me go back. I didn't know when I accepted this job 2 years ago where it would lead me. But I would not have received that email if I didn't work for IndigiNews. I wouldn't have known that my ancestor was in the Smithsonian. So 2 years ago, when I came to IndigiNews, all I knew was I had no industry experience. I was not a trained journalist. I knew that I wasn't qualified for the job. Even the company knew that when they hired me. They were like, "Well, we're taking a gamble on you. We really hope we get lucky. You seem amazing. Like, let's see how this works." And when they offered me the position, like, I was terrified because I knew that I didn't know what I didn't know, if you know what I mean. I wasn't sure if I should take the job. I wasn't sure if I was the right person for the job. I had no idea what the job really entailed or even how the industry worked. I only knew that my people and my culture are the main purpose of my life, that learning my culture, sharing my culture, and protecting my culture are paramount in my life. And I recognized that if I was given the opportunity to lead a media organization that had the ability to educate the greater public and validate the experience of Indigenous people at the same time, that I had a responsibility to take that opportunity. And that's the same reason I'm here, and the same reason I agreed to give this talk to the Alberta Magazine Association and the affiliated magazine associations from across Canada. Thank you. And so back to IndigiNews. Where are we headed? It's been a crazy time thanks to the Online News Act and Meta's reaction to it. We are banned from Facebook. Facebook was responsible for 43% of our page views, and then whoosh, that just disappeared. But we're not ad supported. So far, it hasn't actually drastically affected our financials. It has affected our page views. Our newsletter subscribers are going up. When I arrived here at IndigiNews, there were about 15,000. Now we're at 20,000. And after some tumultuous staffing issues and a steep learning curve, the team's in a good place. I'm in a good place in this position. We're feeling strong. We're feeling cohesive. So I guess we just keep paddling. That's my My presentation, I can obviously, I mean, I could go on, but I'm also happy. Hi means thank you, by the way, in Cree. I'm happy to hop on with Stephanie now if you want to start asking questions. I feel like we can fill up the time, but yeah, here we go.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah?
Mm,
Awesome.
gotcha.
Thank you so much for that talk. I have just I just relate to so much of it. And to hear you speak, it is like listening to someone who is maybe like a couple steps ahead of me on the path. And it is so great to see someone like you who has this position and is telling the stories in this way, and it's so important. um, I did pop a little question in the questions box, but I have others that I wrote down while you were speaking. So
Mhm.
yeah, so this is the first question. An indigenizing the style guide, what an amazing, it's important. And so do you encourage, because I know that the journalism schools do have their own Canadian style guide that we learn and we use in classes. So
Yeah.
do you encourage journalism schools like SAIT to adhere to an Indigenous style guide? How, in your opinion, can they do this, and where can we find a guide like this?
You know, it's so crazy, but first of all, what's SAIT?
Well, okay, so SAIT it's a trade school here, but it's also they do it's one of the journalism schools. So it's the school that I went to, and I
Oh,
love
right. Okay.
there are some. I believe there are some students here that are
Oh,
also.
sorry, that's the class that's here.
Yeah.
I missed that. I didn't make that connection. Yeah, what a question. So, first of all, how our style guide came together was from mostly from one person, Kelsey Kalana. She's one of the people who hired me. She was one of the, I think, the first reporter they brought on when IndigiNews was created in 2020. She's a Silk Okanagan woman, rooted in her culture, and she was not a trained journalist. And for that reason, she went through the newsroom like a hurricane and was like, "No, we're not going to write that," because she she didn't have that training to be like, oh yes, this is how we talk in the industry. No, she was just like, no, this is how I talk as a Silk woman. These are my responsibilities that I have to uphold to my community. And we, the newsroom responded by being like, oh, tell us how you would talk. She's really said that, and then we've just built off it. What I find is if you don't have Indigenous leadership at the top, I think something like this would be impossible to pull off. I say that, even DEI, any of that diversity, equity, inclusion, if you don't have like a manager at the top that it believes in that or understands it's almost impossible to get it started in your newsroom. Even safety and harassment. I know I'm going off here, but I'm talking about Indigenous leadership. Reporters who are subject to harassment online and stuff. I was just at a roundtable yesterday with a bunch of people of color who are the victims of like racial and gendered assault on like Twitter and in their emails, death threats, etc., being called a terrorist. Their newsroom managers who aren't racialized and aren't women don't understand and don't protect them. Don't step in. In fact, they get gaslit, like, oh, it's not so bad. So this was only able to come about because we had Indigenous women in the newsroom and they were leading.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Amen. No, that is so important to have that representation, and otherwise these stories don't really get told. And I did hear you mention something about the parachute journalism, where people
Mhm.
come in and it's very transactional, where they come in and they collect the stories, and then that is just, and then they go, and then they're left with their trauma. Um, what do you think would be a better approach altogether for journalists to come in so it's not so extractive?
That's such a tough question. Like, the reason journalism is extractive is because it was created by white culture. White culture extracts everything. That's how it looks at the world. It doesn't see the earth and see a relation. It doesn't see the moon and realize that that's our grandmother. So, with settler colonialism came that view of like, let's take what we need, throw the rest in the dump. They do that with people. And so most newsrooms, I think, are extractive because they just reflect mainstream culture. Um, and so I don't know how to get out of that. Like newsrooms, I don't know if they're being taught this at school. They are toxic places. I have not met a single reporter from a newsroom that is okay. Like, I'm not trying to discourage you. Please, we need good journalists. But like, holy crap, people! It's newsroom culture is extremely aggressive. My culture traditionally is not aggressive. We are taught to listen. Listening is seen as a weakness in journalism, at least in the newsroom. Like the louder you talk, the faster you talk, the more like intense you are with like, that's what gets rewarded. Aggression is the character trait that's most rewarded in mainstream newsrooms. So there's no easy question to that. We need to create safer newsrooms, but I don't think that can happen with the same people at the top running. The culture is always going to be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I did work in a newsroom, and I agree. It was very violent in the terms of being a young Indigenous woman there, and it was kind of shocking to hear how blatantly racist that it could be, and not just racist but sexist. And it was, yeah, I feel like they're changing. I'm hoping, but that just comes with people, the younger generations coming in and having, right, and more representation. Okay, we have another one asked anonymously. How can the new group of journalists best influence change? Ooh, that's a good question.
By being yourselves, by actually understanding who you really are, because you're not the given name, last name. That's not who you are. You're not a Canadian. That's not who you are. Who you are comes from your ancestors. That's true for you if you come from Europe or Africa or Asia or the North America, the Americas. You have a spiritual purpose for being in this physical world, but we're not taught that in school. That's never reinforced to us by mainstream culture. If you're lucky, you get it from your family, but a lot of Indigenous people do not get that from their families because they've been removed from their culture. Either their grandparents, went to the city and they were raised, third generation in the city, and they've lost touch with some of those teachings, or they themselves were scooped as babies and raised by white people, or their own families were so traumatized that they weren't safe places on the reserve and they were forced to leave. They fled for safety, physical safety reasons. And then you just get cut off. You lose connection with the community. But my understanding of human reality is that we have a path that our ancestors want us to walk. We have a path that our ancestors spent a long time preparing. Decades, generations, thousands of years our ancestors spent preparing this path so that you could be born and walk along it. If you know that, if you know who you are, then when you go into a toxic space like a newsroom, you won't believe the lies they tell you. You might still feel bad, you might still feel hurt, you might still be upset, but you won't be hoodwinked. You won't be gaslit. You'll be like, these people don't understand me, but I understand me. And for me, I smudge twice a day. I smudge in the morning, I smudge at night. I put down tobacco every day. I pray to the grandmothers and grandfathers. I didn't always do this. I've recently learned that we need to express humility when praying. We need to beseech the grandmothers and grandfathers and ask for their pity. The first time I heard that, I was like 38 or something, and I was just like, I'm not going to ask nobody for pity. Like, what? And this was a Cree elder telling me that. I was still like, no. Right? A few steps later, when I was falling a bit lower, I was like, aha, yes, I don't know everything. I do need help. I've learned to be humble. These are powerful, powerful entities that created the universe and that created you and me. And so I've learned to pray with humility, and I ask for their pity. And I do that every day to maintain that connection with myself and with them. To me, that's the only safe way to enter any dangerous space. Also, I'm sure there are non-toxic newsrooms. They're not all toxic, but I've met a lot of journalists in the last 2 years. I've probably met 200. I haven't heard of a safe newsroom out there, except for IndigiNews. Like IndigiNews is very, very different. But we're only tiny. There's 5 of us. But when people come, they go through a period of sort of like collapsing because their nervous system finally has a chance to relax. But yeah, so all I could say is know who you are and ask for protection from your ancestors.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Okay, our next question. Can Eden tell us a bit more about how they support resiliency of staff at IndigiNews? Let me say that again. Can Eden tell us a bit more about how they support resiliency of staff at IndigiNews?
Mm-hmm. This is another thing that can't come from the bottom or the middle. It has to come from the top. We were lucky enough. We are owned by a parent company. We are not independent. But they let us operate autonomously because we explained to them that we are from a different culture and we need to do things differently. So there's a parent company and they own about 5 different outlets, and we sort of are just like apart. So, and I'm the publisher, and me with the editor, Kara, and our other Indigenous aunties on staff who have come and gone over the years. Together, we have crafted a wellness initiative. So what we do primarily, we work 4 days a week. We are allowed to show up as our whole selves at work. We have a meeting every Tuesdays that we call the Head and Heart meeting. It's optional, but it's every Tuesdays at 10. It's kind of like a support group. We're allowed to talk about what's what's in our heart, what's on our mind. It's a chance to share, and you're allowed to share personal if you want to. You can also talk about your work if you want to, but it's like a sacred space where we can share who we are and support one another. We do that once a week. We have instituted a policy of having 1 day a month where the whole newsroom shuts down. We call it the Indigenous Wellness Initiative. And it's on a Wednesday. It's like the 3rd or 4th Wednesday of every month. We just say, don't come in tomorrow. This isn't taken out of your time bank. It's not tracked in the HR software. It's an off the books wellness initiative to support Indigenous employees, but even non-Indigenous employees who do the work and write about Indigenous communities. It's a lot of work, and it's often heavy work. So we believe everybody deserves that day off. And for the Indigenous employees, a lot of them, they arrive carrying a lot on their shoulders. We have Indigenous employees who come, they have generations of trauma and poverty, like intergenerational poverty. We have people sleeping on couches, or there's not the financial literacy because we have been poor for so long that our families don't even know how money works. And so we have people who arrive at the newsroom. They're carrying members of their family who are not well. We're losing people. Like, how many times have we had funerals that team members have to go to? If you're Indigenous, like, you come from a community, there's a lot of loss. We come with pain. We come with everyone on Indigenous on staff either had a parent or a grandparent who went to residential school. We bring that trauma with us. And so that day off is also an acknowledgement of, we just need a little more rest because we're processing so much more. And we're reporting. We're doing really hard work while being Indigenous people who are super triggered by the stuff we have to write about sometimes. It's traumatic, but we believe it needs to be talked about and it needs to be done in a good way, and we want to do that work. So we just try to be gentle. Like, we just have the opposite. We call our newsroom a storytelling lodge, and we try to make it like a nurturing place. Is basically the antithesis of every other newsroom you've ever heard. It's like, oh, do you need the day off? Please take the day. Like, turn in the story late. Like, we don't practice daily news for that reason. Sometimes, I mean, Kara McKenna, she does the daily news. Sometimes she's got that in her blood, so she'll go to a she'll be like, oh, I heard there's a presser in 20 minutes. I'm going to go downtown and pump out a story, and I'll have it up on the website by tomorrow. She has that inner drive. Sometimes she does that, but in general, we do more like slow news. We go in depth. We want to illuminate. We don't just report on like what's happening this week.
Mm-hmm. Mm. Thank you for sharing. Mm-hmm. Okay. Our next question is, what can editors do to honor the two ways of seeing in stories that are submitted by Indigenous writers, i.e. not applying style standards that get in the way of the story? I like this one. It's about Eden, but I did have an editor recently who put the in front of community. And I'm like, it's okay to just say community, because Indigenous peoples will know it's not the community, it's just community. But anyways, I'll let you answer that question.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a perfect example of that. Editors have so much power, and unfortunately, I would say the editing process, if it's a white editor with an Indigenous writer, in my experience, things I've witnessed, things I've been told, that process is a violent one. So first of all, if you don't acknowledge my reality, you're like erasing me. That's a form of violence. And how can you acknowledge my reality when you don't know it? Because Canadians don't know our reality. Like, you don't know, like, like the beauty that lies in our culture, the teachings we hold. Like, I recently found out that in my language we call clouds a sacred blanket. Like, just the beauty that lives within our culture. You know a little bit about the harm, but you don't actually know like the foundation of who we are. And so if you don't know that, editing us, it's going to be an act of violence. And you can do your best, you can try to be supportive, but I think if you're not willing to learn and or be taught by, like, if you have like a superiority complex because you're the editor and they're the reporter, and you're not to hear what they have to say and actually integrate that and learn and apply that going forward, you're not a safe person to be editing that person's story. Mm-hmm. And the thing is too, like, even Indigenous editors, if they've been in the newsroom long enough, they will also enforce those colonial standards. It's, the color of your skin doesn't really matter. It's really that internal understanding. And also having the safety to edit how you want, because a lot of editors, right, if they're in bigger companies, it's not even really up to them. They have to enforce those standards because that's just, otherwise it won't go up on the website. It won't be printed. So yeah, I don't know, man. I mean, educate the editors. I hope there's editors on here. You tell me how you can support, Indigenous writers.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So where can journalists go for trauma-informed training if it's not being offered in newsrooms?
I'm not aware of like a place that offers it regularly. We've offered it a few times. We've done workshops. I think moving forward, we'd like to do more. We don't have capacity right now. There's only 5 of us. Like, I'm doing like 3 jobs. Like, we need to hire more people, but we can't afford to. Kelsey, when she was with IndigiNews, Kelsey Kalana, she ran a couple of trauma-informed workshops, and she was incredible. And when she was with us, we were able to do that because for her, that's her calling, that's her nature. For me to do that, it would be more energy, more time, and I just don't have the ability to do that. So I wish IndigiNews could offer it in the future. We'd love to offer it. I mean, I think you can read books. There's Duncan McHugh's book, Decolonizing the Media. And I think there's a lot of just like, if you go through Twitter and you type in those type of keywords, or you Google, like, you'll find people who have written on the subject or spoken on the subject. But I don't know of any like sort of ongoing training that you can approach or that you can, go find. And also, there was a question earlier from Sylvia Skeen. Says, do you think Greg Younging's guide is also helpful for journalists? I actually had never heard of Greg Younging. I'm not, like I said, I'm not, all knowing about the industry, but I just Googled him. And so I don't know, maybe he wrote something amazing too. It looks like he's passed on. Oh, he's from Pasquayac. That's where Anna is from. Anyway, elements of Indigenous style. I'm going to check that out. I'd never heard about that. So that's cool. So Greg Younging, Google him. Maybe he's a resource.
That's cool. I also realize I have a book here too. It's called Literatures, Communities, and Learning, and conversations with Indigenous writers. So there are lots of books out there, and I think, like, thank you for sharing that, because you're right. It's often true for Indigenous peoples. I think for them to be wearing many hats, right? You're doing many things, and it is a lot of emotional labor to do that work. So you're doing that on top of your everyday job. So it does take a lot to ask, I think, Indigenous peoples to educate others, I think. And unless they're paid to do that or anything, I would kind of steer clear. I guess I'm kind of answering this too, but
what you're saying is don't ask an Indigenous person to educate you for free.
Exactly. There you go. Thank you. Yeah, so there are great books out there that you can find, great resources. Yeah, okay.
I'll never forget the story that Kelsey Kalana told me, because like I said, her nature is to educate. She wants to share her teachings. And so a very well-known photojournalist called her up one day asking questions about, Kelsey's perspective on reporting and parachute journalism and all of that. This was like an award-winning photojournalist. And Kelsey told me 2 hours on the phone with this woman telling her everything from her culture, why, after 2 hours, she was like, does this help? And the woman said, not really.
Oh my gosh.
I was like, I still don't understand what you're talking about. I took 2 hours on the phone with that woman for free.
Never again.
This is why Stephanie's telling you don't call people up and ask for free. It's we arrive exhausted, right? Like, I'm pretty sure I was tired in the womb. Like, we're tired. So compensate us.
Yes, so important. So important. What is next for IndigiNews? For instance, what have you learned about your audience, and are there stories or topics you would like to be doing?
Oh, there's so much. There's so much. I wish we could talk more about treaties. I'm so curious about what Canadians know about treaties and what their understanding is of their responsibilities as part of those treaties. I'd love to talk about the ways in which Canada is not withholding the treaties, and how the treaties, we didn't full sail give away the use of our land or ownership of land. We never believed in ownership, but we never were like, here, you have it, we'll stay on this tiny reserve. What we agreed to was to share the use of the land. And actually, in many treaties, it says up till I think it's like 6 inches under the soil or something like that. We specifically don't give you the rights to mine it. Meanwhile, Canada's like the mining giant. I think 75% of all mining companies are owned by Canada. Anyway, I'd love to learn more about that, but that's not really news. Do you know what I mean? So there's no way to actually do that unless, if there's a webinar or a seminar about it, maybe we could report on the seminar, and that could be a way we talk about it as a news story. But we did recently get a new Indigenous law beat, and we've just struggled to sort of get it off the ground. We have one part-time reporter working on it. We're trying to find another one. And for us, Indigenous law doesn't just mean courts and colonial courts. For us, it's the right to raise your children, your child rearing practices, your language revitalization, food sovereignty. For me, these are all Indigenous law issues. Even the way, I talked to you about, some teachings I have from my ancestors that are my responsibilities. We call that natural law. That would actually be an Indigenous law, right? So yeah, there's exciting things on the horizon, but we're still a tiny team, and I do feel like opportunities are opening up for us, though. I feel like the world seems ready, maybe, for Indigenous journalism and for a new perspective on reality in general because of just how messed up everything is. So there's good things on the horizon. We're meeting lots of people. We have lots of plans. I feel like it's kind of unlimited. As soon as we get more money and start hiring on more people, we can start telling more stories. But one thing I've noticed, even though our reporting is concentrated in what is now called British Columbia, it's like the deeper you go into the reporting into each community, the more you find. So when we're doing our in-depth stories, like it's sort of like I think of everything as a spiral. It's like you just get deeper and deeper, and I find it doesn't matter that you're not covering more surface area when we can go really in depth into certain communities or certain issues or events, like totem pole rematriation and stuff like that. Go into the past, look at how that land was taken back in the 1920s, and I don't know, just beautiful histories of our communities and what they've been through. I feel like even if we're reporting on a small area, those lessons and those stories apply to North America. And I think they're relevant to an international audience, even if we're just reporting really domestically and even centered on a province. And that excites me. And that's what I want to do. I want to take the reporting I'm already doing and get it to more eyeballs. So that's why I've started doing like a roundup, a story roundup on TikTok on Sundays. And we brought Spencer back from our mentorship program, and he's going to be doing TikToks of our stories. And I want to take what we are doing and just bring it to more people. That's my dream. I would love it if we had an American audience. I feel like even if we don't write about America, they might be interested in what we do. They might be interested in our perspectives, our worldviews. That's what I'd love to share. So I hope that's the future of IndigiNews. That's where we're headed.
Mm-hmm. Well, those borders weren't always here, right? So there are our relatives in the South.
Yeah,
So another
absolutely.
question: how can settler media collaborate?
Um, republishing, cross-publishing, um, promoting in your newsletter. There's a link to this organization, or like let us put an ad in your newsletter. We could do like a newsletter swap. Um, Highlighting, doing what Joyce did by inviting me onto this. This is how settler media can collaborate, is by elevating Indigenous voices.
It's just nice to hear the perspective of someone I wish I had you when I was learning. And so I think it's a great and exciting time for young journalists right now.
Yes, exactly. I think you're going to change the world. You see
Mm-hmm.
things differently, and I think as old world sort of gets fractured and starts crumbling, you see the cracks forming in the foundations. Our prophecy tells us that it's meant to fall. It's going to come down. And so let's create something beautiful that's already thriving so that when that does fall, there's something here that we can still hold on to. We don't
Mm-hmm.
lose everything. We'll build something underneath it to like take over for when the old systems fall. And that's coming from the youth. You guys are everything. You have the power of the universe inside of you. You are creating a new world by existing in it and being who you are and bringing your new perspectives to these old institutions. So we need you. I think you're the future. You're the hope.